Hi everyone, my name is Danielle Oregon, and for my final project, I'm going to be discussing the theories of Carl Jung. Being that you already read the chapter, you should be familiar with the concepts that I bring up, but I aim to take this one step further. We should start off by discussing the background of this individual so that we get a better idea of where his arguments stemmed from. Carl Jung was a psychologist that developed analytic psychology somewhat as a response to Sigmund Freud's work. His childhood was lonely, and from a very early age, he began to observe the behaviors of his parents. This correspondingly fed into his argument that we seek partners based on characteristics and traits that were unfulfilled by our parents. For example, if my parents were mean and disrespectful, I would be in search of a partner who is nice and very respectful of my thoughts and beliefs. He is also worldwide known because of his concepts of introverted and extroverted personality. It is very important to be able to distinguish between the two. An introvert is someone who tends to be on the shyer side and does what they can to avoid social situations. On the other hand, an extroverted person is someone who seeks to meet new people, is outgoing, and enjoys being in a group where there are a lot of people and new faces. His research was somewhat built upon the works of Freud. His findings confirmed that of Freud's. But who is this Freud? Sigmund Freud was the founder of psychoanalysis. He is known for his theory of motivation, the subconscious, and mental illness. Collaboration lasted for approximately 5 years. But due to slight differences in their viewpoint, their collaboration unfortunately ended. Specifically, Jung argued with Freud about the sexual basis of neurosis. Now that we have an idea of where his thoughts originated from, let's take a look at his accomplishments. The first accomplishment that he is known for is his differentiation between introverted and extroverted personality types. He then differentiated the 4 functions of the mind, which are thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation. As a boy, Jung had powerful dreams and fantasies that kind of developed with unusual intensities. After some time had passed, he developed a theory that stated that these strange experiences stem from an area of our mind known as the collective unconscious, and this collective unconscious was shared by everyone. Jung devoted the rest of his life to developing his theories and ideas, especially the ones between religion and psychology. He was very interested in religion and hoped to create connections between the realm of psychology and the spiritual world. He emphasized that Christianity is part of a historic process that is necessary for our consciousness. More specifically, Jung was really impressed and intrigued that symbols pop up in our fantasies and dreams, and he decided to look into why this happens. He had also hoped to brighten the lives of the elderly and help them connect with a spiritual belief to kind of brighten their day and help find purpose on this planet. He stated that if they can discover their own myth as popped up in their dreams, they would have more complete personalities. This process was known as individuation. Essentially, his analysis is a psychotherapeutic approach to analytical psychology. An analyst and a patient work together to try to bring up the unconscious characteristics of their personality and help it balance with your conscious personality traits to become a more stable and well-rounded person. This effort aims to find meaning in a person's personality, and kind of help a personality grow as you age. Now that we understand the basis of his theory, it's time to dive deeper into how marriage is seen as a psychological relationship between 2 individuals. Legally, marriage is a union between 2 individuals, but in my eyes, marriage is so much more and has so much more meaning. Being married to someone means that you truly trust and respect each other and that you see one another in your future. It also means that you hope to settle down and maybe grow a family in the near future or in a few years. We see Carl Jung's thoughts on marriage in his essay that he wrote in 1925 called Marriage as a Psychological Relationship. But what exactly does he mean by this? As a whole, the essay aims to highlight that marriage is a complex structure that has both subjective and objective factors. I think that it is very important to go over some sections of the essay so that we can fully comprehend what he's trying to say. Reading this essay as a whole will allow us to get an overall picture of what he's trying to entail, but diving deeper section by section will allow us to get the small details and little thoughts that he's putting into his work. Regarded as a psychological relationship, marriage is a highly complex structure made up of a whole series of subjective and objective factors, mostly of a very heterogeneous nature. As I wish to confine myself here to the purely psychological problems of marriage, I must disregard in the main the objective factors of a legal and social nature. Although these cannot fail to have a pronounced influence of a psychological relationship between the marriage partners. Whenever we speak of a psychological relationship, we presuppose one that is conscious, for there is no such thing as a psychological relationship between two people who are in a state of unconsciousness. From the psychological point of view, they would be wholly without relationship. From any other point of view, the physiological, for example, they could be regarded as related, but one could not call a relationship psychological. It must be admitted that though such total unconsciousness as I have assumed does not occur, there is nevertheless a not inconsiderable degree of partial unconsciousness, and the psychological relationship is limited in the degree to which that unconsciousness exists. In the child, consciousness rises out of the depths of unconsciousness psychic life. At first, like separate islands, which gradually unite to form a continent and continuous landmass of consciousness. Progressive mental development means, in effect, extension of consciousness. With the rise of a continuous consciousness, and not before, psychological relationship becomes possible. So far as we know, consciousness is always ego consciousness. In order to be conscious of myself, I must be able to distinguish myself from others. Relationship can only take place where this distinction exists. But although the distinction may be made in a general way, normally it is incomplete because large areas of psychic life still remain unconscious. As no distinction can be made with regard to unconscious contents, on this terrain, no relationship can be established. Here, there still reigns the original unconscious condition of the ego's primitive identity with others. In other words, a complete absence of relationship. The young person of marriageable age does, of course, possess an ego consciousness, girls more than men as a rule, but since he has only recently emerged from the midst of original consciousness, he is certain to have wide areas which still lie in the shadow and which preclude to that extent the formulation of psychological relationship. This means, in practice, that the young man or woman can have only an incomplete understanding of himself and others, and is therefore imperfectly informed as to his and their motives. As a rule, the motives he acts from are largely unconscious. Subjectively, of course, he thinks himself very conscious and knowing, for we constantly overestimate the existing content of consciousness, and it is a great and surprising discovery when we find that what we had supposed to be the final peak is nothing but the first step in a very long climb. The greater the area of unconsciousness, the less is marriage a matter of free choice. As is shown subjectively in the fatal compulsion one feels so acutely when one is in love. The compulsion can exist even when one is not in love, though in less agreeable form. It's important to talk about what all of this means. So the essay first opens up by regarding marriage as a psychological relationship, but then it also goes on to claim that the social nature of the relationship influences the relationship between the partners. The essay then goes on to discuss the unconscious aspects of the relationship. Jung also explains that there are motives that come from the parental influence. Unconsciously, though, I think that it is the strength of the bond to the parents that influences us choices of a husband or a wife, which is further reinforced by Jung. Unconsciously, we look for everything to compensate for the lives of our parents, the ambitions that they couldn't fulfill. That's unconsciously passed down to the children. The start of the essay also then goes on to discuss that people have an incomplete understanding of themselves and those that they are surrounded by. He claims that we over-exaggerate our capabilities of our consciousness and we sort of underestimate the power of our unconscious. We don't realize how much power it holds when making everyday decisions. We may not realize it, but our unconscious pushes us to make certain decisions, whether it's being with someone specific or a decision just solely based on instinct, whether we like it or not. Our conscious love for our parents allows us to favor a choice of a partner, but our unconscious love for them makes a choice more challenging because we are seeking out characteristics that fulfill us so that we can sustain a long relationship. Given the scenario that a marriage is not arranged, our instincts for our partners stem from the unconscious. He also thinks that an active and healthy sex life deepens a relationship by providing us with a feeling of unity, which I completely agree with. When you're being intimate with someone, you're basically giving them your all. It's different than having very deep conversations with either a friend that's a girl or a friend that's a guy that you solely have a friendship with. But when you're in a relationship and you're having intimate moments, it's completely different. You feel as though you are one, as though you are united. So he describes the sex ultimately as the glue of the relationship. And he says that this action is the complete harmony of the individuals. One of the most important life urges is sex. So by engaging in this activity, we are basically becoming prisoners of this urge. This is very similar to Schopenhauer because Jung also claims that a relationship has a biological basis of the maintenance of our species. Whether we know it consciously or not, we are seeking out to find partners that we can have good offspring with. The goal of the maintenance of our species is the ultimate goal of our collective unconscious that we all share. It's a link between partners and what makes us one. The partners of a marriage seek to grow together as a team and become a stronger unity, not as individual relationships. But when we talk about relationships, it's important to note our foundation and where it all began. So as a child, we have very small limits and only really know what our parents teach us. But as we age, our knowledge of the world expands and we begin to be influenced by TVs, by our friends, and other things that we're surrounded by. And we also influence those that surround us as well. Our will begins to display on surface level as we age, and they're pursued by our unconscious motivations. However, at first, our life is dedicated to pursuing our passions, but eventually becomes a duty when the number of responsibilities that we have when we get older increases. As time progresses, we must care for the children that we may have brought into this world. The transition from I want to I must becomes present because now you need to care for a family, you need to care for your children, you need to pay your bills, which isn't something that you really were concerned about when you were younger. Your parents cared for it, and now it's your turn to do the same. So at this point in our lives, Jung claims that we should have begun to settle, and our motives that were influenced by our unconscious should start to make sense to us. Realizations about ourselves begin to appear, and we kind of get more insight to our ultimate fate, what we're put on this planet for. He also claims that the second chapter, as we want to call it, of our lives differ from our previous years. However, adapting to marriage is hard, and some people adapt with greater ease compared to others. Jung states that a partner who has a positive relationship with their parents will find a small difficulty adjusting to their partner. However, someone who is hindered by an unconscious tag to their parents will take more time to adapt to their partner. It is also important to go over the end of his essay to grasp his concluding thoughts on this matter. In its first stages, it is far from that, for it creates a compulsive dependence based on unconscious motives other than the biological ones. Rider Haggard's she gives some indication of the curious world of ideas that underlies the anima projection. They are, in essence, spiritual contents, often in erotic disguise, obvious fragments of a primitive mythological mentality that consists of archetypes and whose totality constitutes the collective unconscious. Accordingly, such a relationship is at bottom collective and non-individual. If such a projection fastens on to one of the marriage partners, a collective spiritual relationship conflicts with the collective biological one and produces in the container the division or disintegration I have described above. If he is able to hold his head above water, he will find himself through this very conflict. In that case, the projection, though dangerous in itself, would have helped him to pass from a collective to an individual relationship. This amounts to full conscious realization of the relationship that marriage brings. Since the aim of this paper is a discussion of the psychology of marriage, the psychology of projection cannot concern us here. It is sufficient to mention it as a fact. One can hardly deal with a psychological marriage relationship without mentioning, even at the risk of misunderstanding, the nature of its critical transitions. As is well known, one understands nothing psychological unless one has experienced it oneself. Not that this ever prevents anyone from feeling convinced that his own judgment is the true and competent one. This disconcerting fact comes from the necessary over-evaluation of the momentary concept of consciousness, for without this concentration of attention, one could not be conscious at all. Thus, it is that every period of life has its own psychological truth, and the same applies to every stage of psychological development. There are even stages which only the few can reach, it being a question of race, family, education, talent, and passion. Nature is aristocratic. The normal man is a fiction, although certain general valid laws do exist. Psychic life is a development that can easily be arrested on the lowest levels. It is as though every individual had a specific gravity, in accordance with which he either rises or sinks down to the level where he reaches his limit. His views and convictions will be determined accordingly. No wonder, then, that by far the greater number of marriages reach their upper psychological limit in fulfillment of the biological aim, without injury to spiritual or moral health. Relatively few people fall into deeper disharmony with themselves, where this is a great deal of pressure from outside. The conflict is unable to develop much dramatic tension for sheer lack of energy. Psychological insecurity, however, increases in proportion to social security, unconsciously at first, causing neurosis, then consciously bringing with it separations, discord, divorces, and other marital disorders. On still higher levels, new possibilities of psychological development are discerned, touching on the sphere of religion where critical judgment comes to a halt. Progress may be permanently arrested on any of these levels, with complete unconsciousness of what might have followed at the next stage of development. As a rule, graduation to the next stage is barred by violent prejudices and superstitious fears. This, however, serves a most useful purpose, since a man who is compelled by accident to live at a level too high for him becomes a fool and a menace. After reading this section of the essay, we can come to the conclusion that when we first meet a partner and first get closer to a partner, there are unconscious motives that make us do so. But as time progresses, the fact that we have biological drives to maintain the species is highlighted. Marriage is ultimately a unity between two people in order to keep the species going. We come to the knowledge of love through failure and success, which is a lifelong process as we endure and more experiences with it. Consciousness is the foundation for how a relationship can exist because consciousness provides us with a distinction between me and you. With no distinction, there is no relationship. In the unconscious, there is no individual identity. You and I are practically the same. This identity is called the collective unconscious. Only our consciousness can provide a distinction between you and I, or me and my mom, or me and my friend. But the unconscious is unable to do so. Free choice in a marriage can be linked to the unconscious tie to a parent. A mom may be keeping herself unconscious to a dissatisfying marriage. Therefore, she unconsciously binds herself to her son in order to make up for the dissatisfaction in her marriage. Unconsciously, she's impacting her son's choice when he decides to go ahead and find a partner. As a result, Jung claims that individual happiness is bound to suffer because of these unconscious ties that we may have to our parents.
Thank you guys for watching.